Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first video recording of the Haringey Education Partnership Insight and Intelligence Squad. I'm Luke Kemper, and I'm here with Fran Hargrove. And today we are going to talk about a hot topic in education, and that is adaptive teaching. And I think the first question we should address here is, why are we talking about adaptive teaching? So, Fran, what do you think? Why?
Well, Luke, thank you. I'm blessed with to be included in the insight and intelligence. Some would argue that I possess neither, but anyway, we'll give it a go. The reason that we are speaking about adaptive teaching today, because it's one of those edgy words that has popped up through Ofsted and various other places. And if you're an avid reader of Twitter or follower of Twitter, it's appearing there more and more. But it's one of those words that's been knocking around the education system for a while, and it means different things to different people. So we thought we might unpick this a little bit, because there's been a whole world of differentiation bad, adaptive teaching good. But what does that actually mean? So I think we're going to spend a bit of time unpicking that, aren't we, Luke?
Indeed, we are. And we'll start with what actually is adaptive teaching. And while we get into that, we need to kind of start with its precursor, which Fran mentioned, which is differentiation. And differentiation is where teachers are creating distinct tasks for either individual students or more likely groups of students. But these are different tasks for groups within a classroom, within the same classroom. And differentiation, the kind of bad part of that is that it can really lead to different groups of students learning at different paces, and therefore, in the end, different learning outcomes. Students will end up at different levels, and that's what we really want to avoid. So adaptive teaching takes differentiation, it's kind of an evolution of it, and it focuses on the entire class and what the outcome will be for the entire class, even if there is some differentiation for individual student needs. So we'll take a look at this picture here that says differentiation in the classroom. And I don't know, Fran, does that look like a cohesive classroom to you?
Well, it could do, but it might not do. So it's kind of really indicative of the confusion around differentiation and adaptive teaching, really. You've got children there doing different things, maybe working towards the same thing, working individually, some working together. It's kind of a bit of a mixed bag, which is how, this is kind of jumbled up, and which is why we're going to try and sort it out. So, it's not a case that differentiation is not required. It is. There'll always be a child or some children that will need a curricula that is different, that might be slightly to the left or to the right, or presented in a different way. But adaptive teaching, I think, is about addressing the class as a whole, about seeing the class as a whole and manipulating your craft in order to get everybody to the same place, rather than perhaps dumbing down the curriculum, leading to lower expectations. So that's what we're going to unpick a bit further.
Yeah, definitely. And so we'll start with some kind of official definitions or guidelines of adaptive teaching. And this comes from the teachers' standards from the DFE in 2011, defining it as, teachers adapting their teaching to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils. Sounds great. But when we look at these kind of bullet points a little bit more closely, we can see how this kind of breaks down and is a little bit dangerous. So I'll let you guys go over the bullet points yourselves, but I just want to break down some of the kind of dangers or gray areas that these could lead to if followed to the letter. And the first one is differentiating appropriately, right? And yes, like Fran just mentioned, differentiating appropriately is important and really essential if you're going to be teaching. But there is a dark side of that, right? And we'll get more into that later with the kind of challenges of adaptive teaching. But if you're differentiating, you may also think, oh, I need to give different students different tasks based on what their learning styles, which is another fallacy, right? We don't want teachers to kind of fall into these disproved methods when they're using adaptive teaching. Um, Other problems with this is that, having a secure understanding of the range of factors that inhibit pupils' abilities to learn, great. And yeah, you can again argue that's essential, but it's really general. I mean, what are those? This is going to vary massively in the classroom. Um, and third here, when you're looking at an awareness of the physical, social, and intellectual development of children, um, you know, it's just really important to make sure that we don't go down the route of Piaget's stages of development, which have also kind of recently been disproved in studies of cognitive science. Children don't, linearly progress through these stages of development. So there's just like little inklings of danger that are popping up, red flags per se, about some of these guidelines.
Yeah, if I could get a butt in there, Luke. And as you said, this is from the teacher standards, which were produced in 2011. So that's quite a while ago. And it talks about adaptive teaching and using differentiation appropriately. And I think, that is where the two things are getting a bit fudged now, is that, a document from 2011 uses the word adaptive teaching, but we're also seeing it pop up in what's in the most recent iteration of the Ofsted framework, is that Ofsted inspectors are looking, is teaching adapted appropriately? And the nuance of that is looking quite different. And as Luke mentioned, there's lots of kinds of things that are debunked now, like the visual, audio, and kinesthetic aspects of learning. And teachers spent hours making sure there was a visual, and audio, and a kinesthetic element to their planning and to their delivery. And it's about looking at, okay, what does the cognitive science tell us, and what can we reasonably do and weave into our craft as teachers in order to ensure that children have access to their full curriculum entitlement, and that the kind of ambition for each and every child is high, and those needs are met within a reasonable mainstream classroom setting for every child, and meeting those needs.
Right. And I think that the updated frameworks, at least for the newer early career framework from the DFE in 2019, really makes a lot of that clearer and goes more toward those aims. So I just want to put this up here. This is the part of adaptive teaching that forms the ECF, and I want to highlight some of the things that are really important. So seeking to understand people's differences, yes, we had that from the previous framework there, but knowing their different levels of prior knowledge is crucial for adaptive teaching, and also those potential barriers to learning, which are not, like we explained before, something like, oh, I'm a visual learner or an audio learner. No, it's not things like that, but different students may react differently to different content. Without getting too deeply into it, knowing those barriers is important. And another core aspect of adaptive teaching is providing targeted support to pupils. So again, this kind of gets back to knowing your pupils, right, and knowing where they are. But targeted support to pupils who maybe don't have as much background knowledge can be really helpful. And important to highlight here as well, we don't want to set different expectations, right? The focus of adaptive teaching is on the whole class getting to an outcome. So it is not useful if you're differentiating tasks and or outcomes for pupils, even if perhaps they are not picking up the subject matter as quickly as some of their peers. So I think those are some of the really important points on this newer early career framework.
And I think there's a bit of clarity also needed here. I think there's a lot of words are being used for some fairly simple kind of themes here. So understanding where your pupils are at, that is an absolute key piece, is what did they learn before? What do they know? Where are they at broadly and more specifically? And what are the barriers to some children and some students learning? And then providing that targeted support does not mean differentiating a myriad of ways, breaking things down, expecting some pupils to do a lot less. It's more around, do I need to adapt my questioning perhaps for this child or this group of pupils? Do I need to ensure that some pupils have had some pre-teaching of vocabulary and some explanations before they enter this unit or this lesson or this session of work? Is that going to enable them to really kind of build their schemata around that lesson? You know, is it a simple fact of that they, you know, their vocabulary needs developing a little ahead of that lesson? You know, am I making sure that I'm not setting lower expectations? Do I have a really clear, as a teacher, a really clear understanding of what it is I want the pupils to know and understood and have really absorbed by the end of the lesson and the unit? And how am I going to ensure that every child gets there? So it's kind of planning up, scaffolding down, whether that be through vocabulary, pre-teaching of vocabulary, pre-thinking about the kinds of questions, maybe how the order in which I might ask those questions. So those of you that are familiar with Tom Sherrington's walkthroughs, and I take the very popular cold calling, I might ask a question that I might target towards a more able child. And then ask a less able child to maybe rephrase what has already been spoken about, or I might ask a less able child to give the initial answer and then ask another child to maybe add to or elaborate on that original answer. Or do I need to ask a slightly different question rather than having different tasks? And the effort, I suppose, for adaptive teaching for me, the more I've learned about it and the more I've read about it, is that it goes into the planning rather than the task design. It's the adaptation of my teaching and the craft of my teaching rather than task design and delivery. And it's around that monitoring the impact or engagement and motivation, particularly for those low attaining pupils. So it's just keeping a real eye out for making sure that those pupils are included and are motivated and engaged. You know, when things are too hard, we disengage. And, you know, that's where I would start throwing rubbers around the classroom, I think.
Yes, definitely. And we'll talk more about some of the methods that you mentioned there, Fran, when we talk about implementation. But just a few other things to point out also from the ECF here. So these are just kind of general helpful guidelines that teachers can follow. And I think I just want to point out a few things here. You know, this is not rocket science. It's not something that's brand new that, you know, teachers really need to read a manual about or something like that. Good teachers will probably find that they're already doing a lot of these things. And that's fantastic, because also that means, you know, if you are already doing most of these things, then implementing adaptive teaching is not going to be that much of a challenge for you. But, you know, it is recognized that understanding where your pupils are, their levels of prior knowledge, and, you know, appropriately differentiating tasks is a challenge. It shouldn't necessarily be overwhelming in terms of creating an unnecessary workload, and that's where that key planning comes in, right? The planning beforehand, and also, of course, understanding the starting point for your pupils. So anyway, here are just a few more tips there. And Fran, if you'd like to add anything.
So I think those things on the right-hand side of the screen, the benefits for learners. So it's, you know, in a nutshell, know what they've learnt before, know what the abilities are in your classroom, know that they understand that, you know, different children require different things from you as a teacher rather than the things that are on the table in front of them. And then for you as teachers is don't spend your heavy lifting time, spend your attention on how can I adapt my teaching in the moment? How can I plan ahead for my teaching in order to meet the needs of the pupils rather than task design again? And build in lots of opportunities to check for understanding, for recap, and all of those things. And then it's seeing your class as a whole rather than three groups, three ability groups. I think that's, you know, as simple as that, is see your class as a whole and wanting to move them together and just changing the surface of the road, as it were, rather than seeing them as three different groups of pupils that you're trying to teach all at the same time. It's a kind of almost a mindset thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, seeing your class as a whole is well, you could argue that's one of the benefits of adaptive teaching. You could also argue that that's, you know, just what a good teacher would do anyway. But let's look a little bit at the benefits here. This is quite short, but quite powerful. So we have, according to the 2015 PISA results, adaptive instruction is actually one of the approaches that's most correlated positively with student performance. And, you know, that is primarily because a good teacher who is doing this adaptive instruction is really bringing their whole class along, and leading them to a final outcome that is going to reflect positively in exams like PISA exams. So, you know, this promotes high attainment for all, but not only that, it's also really a useful strategy for an inclusive classroom, because, like we mentioned before, we're not creating groups and then kind of keeping students in those same groups, and maybe we have like a lower attaining group and a higher attaining group. No, you're going to be able to mix your students up. Some students in a, let's say, lower attaining group might have different prior knowledge that may be useful in a certain subject, and then are able to take the lead if you've adapted your teaching correctly for a certain subject or lesson. So really great in terms of creating a fully inclusive classroom. And that is also inclusive of students with SEND as well.
Can I just kind of throw in that I think the 2015 PISA results have a much better description. It's adaptive instruction rather than adaptive teaching. And I think that is actually quite a helpful nuance in language that helps us understand that a little bit more. It is a lot around that adaptive instruction, though, you know, you will need to provide certain scaffolds, tools and resources for some children, and that is as it should be. Again, that's good practice, but I think adaptive instruction is a much better description.
Yeah, and that is an interesting distinction. And you know, there is some different, like these books I put here. So adaptive teaching has it there. There may be some different literature about adaptive instruction. Have to look more into the difference there. But yeah, so let's move on. And I want to go, we mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but I want to go and talk about the kind of dangers first, and then also challenges of implementing adaptive teaching. So take us through this, Fran.
I love this cartoon. I'm not a great follower of The Simpsons, so I'm getting more and more into it. But this one, this little snippet has been sent to me several times. So, you know, Bart Simpson, for all his glory, sums it up. So let me get this straight. We're behind the rest of the class and we're going to catch up by going slower than they are. Yeah. So that is kind of the real illustration of really poor differentiation, really, is, you know, when actually we want to be thinking about catch up, keep up. As more of a way forward. So, you know, I think that is in essence what, if every teacher thinks about that, every practitioner thinks about okay, they're never going to catch up if we're going to go slower and teach them less. So what can we do to avoid that? And I think you'll pretty much have the best of adaptive teaching and differentiation rolled into one, don't you think, Luke?
Yeah, yeah. But like we said before, it could be potentially really easy to slip into these problems of differentiation when you're trying to, adaptively teach. I don't know if I just coined that or whatever, but yeah, obviously adaptive teaching partly is about closing the gaps as well, and we want to do that. And if we go with what is happening at Bart Simpson's school in Springfield, they are not closing the gaps; they are making them wider. So I plucked out a few of the sentences that I thought were poignant from the EEF blog here. And I just want to draw some attention to them here. It says over here on the first one, it says at the bottom, right, creating a multitude of differentiated resources is not helpful. And that's a thing, right? We said it a little bit before, but adaptive teaching is not about adding so much to the workload. In fact, differentiation, its older cousin, is more about that, right? So adaptive teaching actually, when executed properly, should save teachers time. Um, and, you know, this was also brought up before, but we acknowledge that this is challenging. It is not so easy to even understand one individual's prior knowledge and their thinking and their behaviors in class. Doing it with the entire class is tough. But this is something that a good teacher takes it upon themselves to do. And so, again, adaptive teaching is not like this magic bullet word that, once I'm an adaptive teacher, once you've got that, then, your classroom is magically going to change. No, it requires work. And I think the DFE, I think the EEF, and we at HEP and everyone kind of acknowledges that this is not so easy. It requires effort. All right. Let's continue on and look at a little bit of implementation. So how can we implement adaptive teaching? So when we look at it, yes, like I just mentioned, it is a challenge. One thing that is really helpful, and we'll provide you with some questions to ask your school, your staff members, other teachers on the next slide. But one thing that is helpful is kind of really nailing down a definition of adaptive teaching for your school. But another way, when you're in the classroom, is scaffolding. And Fran, you mentioned this before, and if you would elaborate on it again, that would be fantastic.
I always think kind of scaffolding is another one of those words that's kind of thrown around quite a lot, saying, we scaffold our pupils. Well, what do you actually mean by that? And that, for me has been, and I've said it earlier, is being really clear about the end point for that lesson, for that unit of work, what it is that you want the children to be able to know, do, understand, what is it contributing to in the up and coming learning, and what is it drawn upon from pupils' prior learning. And if I want every child to pretty much get to this end point in my lesson or this unit of work, what can I do to ensure that they all have a fair shot at that? And again, that might be, looking at the things around the green circle there. Is there some reading aloud or reading with partners? Is there modelling? Is there some group work, partner work, mixed ability or separate ability? Who's working with the children? Is there sentence structures or starters that the children can use and that some children can use in order to help them verbalize their responses and verbalize their thinking? Have we connected it to the background knowledge? Are they building on things? Are there any kind of graphic organizers or word banks? Are there visual representation of some words or some things for children to kind of hang hooks on? And that kind of use of first language, is it appropriate or even able to do that in your lesson? So it's those kind of, it's scaffolding is, what are those scaffolding bars and ladders and building blocks that we can give to children that will enable them to participate in, engage, and be in receipt of the same ambition and learning and gain the same knowledge and understanding as other pupils. And it might be that you remove some things. So scaffolding isn't always about adding things on, it might be removing barriers. So for example, if you have a child that is, you know, well able in history or geography, but, you know, really struggles to write, take the pencil and paper out of it, get them to record it, get them to work in a pair where somebody else is the scribe it for them. So sometimes it's thinking about, okay, what do I need to remove from this task or from this element of work or element of learning in order for a child to be able to really achieve. So, you know, adaptive teaching for me is about addition of some things and removal of others, but not planning three ways.
Yeah, and I love scaffolding because of the parallels that you can draw with cognitive science as well, right? I mean, one of the biggest purposes for scaffolding is not to overload the working memory of your students, right? And you can build scaffolds around things that they already know, you know, take things away once they've got it imprinted on their deep memory, and you know, it just really works well with the idea of how the brain works and how we learn. Okay, so like I mentioned, there are some further questions here that if you're a school leader, you might consider asking your staff. Um, because like we mentioned before, you know, adaptive teaching does come up in Ofsted, and it's useful for the school to have a kind of clearly defined definition of a clearly defined idea of how they are implementing adaptive teaching. So take those questions, use them. There might be some other ones to add to it. I don't know. What do you think, Fran?
I think there's always more questions to add to things, to be fair. But, you know, just going back to the kind of articulating, well, you know, if an Ofsted inspector were to ask me how I was adapting my teaching in a history lesson, for example, it might be, I might talk around how I'm using cold calling to explicitly ask different groups of children or different children within my class different kinds of questions, but working towards the same end. It might be that I've had, you know, during the break time or whenever before the lesson, I had a group of children that I was pre-teaching vocabulary to. It might be that I've asked another child to record their answers on a small microphone or through a talk partner. You know, it's not rocket science, and I think it's there's a lot of mystique around that, and I think that's what we've kind of tried to do today, isn't it, Luke? Is just kind of demystify it. It is good teaching. It's thinking about the craft of your teaching for every lesson in order to meet the needs of the children. Sometimes you're going to add things, sometimes you're going to take them away. But it's knowing, the essence of it is knowing your children, knowing what they already know, and knowing what barriers they have to their learning and adapting accordingly.
That I think is a perfect summary, and therefore we will end there. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was useful in demystifying adaptive teaching. Obviously, if you have, you know, any questions or comments, you can be in touch with us. And I'll give you the contact details through whatever media you use to watch this. So thanks again, and thank you, Fran, for joining me for this Insight and Intelligence HEP session.
Thank you very much, Luke.